I'm Marilyn Moore, and this is part 3 of my interview with George H. Smith, author of Atheism, The Case Against God. George wrote most of Atheism, The Case Against God, when he was 23. The book was first published in hardcover by Nash Publishing in 1974. Prometheus Books published a paperback edition in 1979, and that version has been in print ever since. In this segment, George discusses how Atheism, The Case Against God, came to be written. It was, he explains, kind of an accident. George also discusses his dissatisfaction with the free thought movement of the 1960s and why Ayn Rand's approach to atheism appealed to him. George remains an atheist to this day, no second thoughts. But that doesn't mean he hasn't read and thought about religion. Quite the contrary. George finds religion a fascinating subject, and he has a high regard for some of the great Christian philosophers. In short, George's approach to religion is anything but simplistic. Just one of the things that I find interesting about him. So, you're a young man. You've completed a deconversion process.
Yes.
What are you doing out in the world that motivates you to write Atheism, The Case Against God? It wasn't enough to just have the deconversion on your own?
Well, that book, as I've also, and I'm sorry to repeat myself if some people have read this, but let me just explain the setup for that. When I discovered Ayn Rand after I'd been in free-thought for about 2.5 years, and that's an important point in this transition. So do you mind if I just mention that a second, because you have to understand that to understand the book. Like I said, I started reading free-thought literature sophomore in high school. I saw Rand on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show. She had 3 appearances. I happened to just watch all 3 of them. After I saw the first one, I really liked her. And then I watched the other 2. I'd never heard of her, never read anything about her. The thing I liked about Rand, I don't remember which show it was. Unfortunately, somebody on YouTube recently uploaded the first appearance. And I'm glad to see that because I thought all were lost. I don't know if the other 2 even exist. But at one point, Carson asked her, something like, I understand you're an atheist. And she said, of course. And that was it. It was sort of like, what else? I mean, you know. Now, you have to understand that growing up, so to speak, intellectually on free thought, there are a lot of kooks in all these movements, these sort of edgy, these sort of on-the-edge movements, and free thought was no exception. I ran across, read things by freethinkers, self-proclaimed freethinkers, just lunatic. I mean, Christians seemed models of rationality compared to some of the free thought stuff I was reading. There were problems with an outfit in San Diego at the time. A leading free thought publisher had taken over a bunch of racist anti-Semites, and they were publishing this god-awful stuff, like the Negro a beast, and the movement was at a low ebb, shall we put it that way. Okay. And it had gotten mixed up with a bunch of other stuff. I remember reading vegetarian literature that condemned almost all vegetables. You're only supposed to eat certain types of nuts and certain types of berries, and it was just, it just became almost not all free thinkers, but I just didn't like the atmosphere of free thought. And on the ethical side, the so-called humanist side, writers, and there are some decent writers, but the ethics always struck me as just sort of a secularized version of Christian ethics. Love your neighbor, try to do good. It just is what I call soft, fuzzy, feel-good stuff. And it just didn't satisfy me. It's like, where's some substance here, you know? We should try to help people, be kind to people. And that sort of thing always annoyed me because it's so cheap, it's so easy. And I thought, don't free thinkers have anything better than this to offer? Well, of course they did. I wasn't that well read, but in the contemporary humanist literature of the time, that's how it came across to me. What Rand would call altruism. The same things I was reading in Christian literature, it's just without God and Jesus. It was like, and they were always praising Jesus as a wonderful moral teacher, sort of like the deists did too. Now, I didn't mind that so much, but anyway, I saw Rand. I went a few months later. I happened to be in a bookstore. I didn't go looking for it, but I saw The Virtue of Selfishness. I was with a good friend of mine, and I remember thinking, "Now that's a book for me." I didn't know selfishness was a virtue, and I was taken with her immediately. And I was taken with her because her attitude to religion was sort of, it's no big, being an atheist is no big deal. Rand always considered atheism to be a side issue. I mean, her colleague at the time, Nathaniel Brandon, wrote an article in the Objectivist newsletter about, I think, on atheism or on agnosticism. But it just wasn't a central tenet of her philosophy. Now that may raise the question, well, how come I made it such a big deal by writing, in fact, 3 books on the subject? Well, I did that primarily as just sort of a focus point to talk about other aspects of philosophy, because by then I was hip deep in the free thought movement. I knew a lot. I corresponded with Joseph Lewis in New York, who was the head of one of the best known atheists at the time. I was an avid correspondent with free thinkers. And I thought, you know, some reworking really needs to be done here philosophically. The groundwork of atheism isn't that solid. And what happened was, while I was in college, I had formed a group called Students of Objectivism. That's a story in itself. But it was basically a philosophy discussion group. It wasn't one of those dogmatic cult things that people associate with Rand. And I must say that that's only a small percentage of Rand's followers. Most Randians, as I call them, are just like Rand as a philosopher, and they don't get into that cult nonsense. And we weren't into it. But while I think my last year in college, I didn't complete college. I wrote what happened was somebody set up a talk for me to give at my former high school, Rincon. They were having some kind of religion in life week, and they were having different representatives of different religions come in and give talks to a particular class, or maybe it was an assembly. And it was done in a proper way. They weren't preaching, they were just sort of giving an account of their religion. I don't remember the contact I had at Rincon, but somebody set up for me to give a talk on atheism. They thought, well, if you're going to have Christians and Jews and Muslims, etc., then why not have an atheist? I agreed to do it. I got on my typewriter. I was smart enough not to make it very long, but I wrote out about a 20-minute speech, and then the rest was going to be Q&A. I had about an hour. That was the first thing I wrote. Well, at the last minute, like the day before, I got a call, and they canceled it. Not the whole program, just me, the atheist, because it was considered scandalous. Too many parents were complaining that an atheist would get up and speak. So apparently it was okay for all kinds of nutty ideas to go out there, if all it was called religion. But if an atheist said, I don't believe any of this stuff, that was considered offensive. And my talk was strictly philosophical. It was sort of stuff we talked about, lack of belief in God. Maybe we'll get into it later, but where the burden of proof lies. It was a standard kind of, you know, I'm not an evil person, I just don't believe this stuff, and here's why I don't believe. Anyway, I later took that and used it. I thought, well, I didn't want that talk to go to waste, so I turned it into about a 60-page piece, which went through the basic stuff. Very succinct. It wasn't, I haven't had a copy of it for years. It was called The Case for Atheism. I ran it off on a mimeograph machine that I had, and I had offset covers made. They were pretty good. It was a black background with white lettering called The Case for Atheism. And friends and I got together and we made 150 copies, stapled them, put some black tape for a spine. And they were like this little 8.5 by 11, magazine type thing. And we set them up at our table in the student mall, and 150 copies sold out like within less than a week at $1.50 each. And that gave me something, that's actually visible about atheism. And after that, I didn't really plan on writing anymore, and I'm going to have to continue this, explain it. I'll make it as brief as I can. I ended up quitting the university, going out with a friend at the LA area. Why, I wasn't sure. Maybe I thought I'd open up a philosophy shop or something. And after working in a warehouse about a year, I thought, maybe getting my degree is not such a bad idea. But meanwhile, I met a guy that I've written about recently on the libertarianism.org site, Roy Childs. And I had known him through correspondence through some of his articles. He's a libertarian like I was. And make a long story short, Roy moves out shortly before I'm scheduled to move back to Tucson. And we get along extremely well. Roy doesn't want to lose his partner in conversation. Roy had known about or read this earlier thing I'd written in college called A Case for Atheism, and had a copy of it. So he keeps saying, well, what can I get you to stay in the LA area? And he didn't want me to, he was pretty selfish on his part. He didn't want me to go back to school because I'd go back to Tucson and he'd lose a friend. And I said, nothing. I said, and it was true. I was, when he first brought it up, I was a couple of weeks of, I'd already quit my job, I had given notice on my apartment and that sort of thing. So less than a week to go, he calls me up and said, well, would you stay if I could get you a contract to write a book on atheism? And I didn't know Roy. I went, yeah, sure, Roy. That's how I said it. I said, yeah, sure, Roy. I said, I've got no credentials. I'm leaving Los Angeles in 5 days. If you can get me a book contract in 5 days, sure, I'll stay in Los Angeles. I said it in that very sarcastic way. Then he says, I'll see what I can do. Well, I didn't know it, but Roy knew a publisher who was a sort of a neo-objectivist or Randian publisher in LA called Ed Nash, Rand Nash Publishing. Nash had been looking for someone to write a book on the topic. Roy didn't tell me that. He just made it like he was going to one cold to a publisher. So Roy apparently called Nash and had been discussing with him the possibility. He calls me back later that day and says, oh, I've set up an appointment with Nash, he wants to talk to you. And Nash originally wanted to see some sample chapters, and all I had was that case for atheism. I said, I'm not going to stick around writing sample chapters, right? He said, no, he'll accept that as a sample of your writing. And I know it's kind of a long story, but within a few days, Roy and I were at the Nash offices and I signed a book contract. So the short answer to your question is, the book was kind of an accident. I didn't plan on writing it. It was just because a friend wanted to figure out a way to keep me in LA that it was written.
That's interesting. So that there you are, embarked on a career as an atheist. Which is a somewhat unlikely career path for a young man.
Yeah, I'm not sure career is the right word. I've become known as that because I subsequently wrote 2 other books. Both have atheism in the title. I have a 4th book coming out, hopefully in a few more months, that is actually a history of political thought, so at least that doesn't have the word atheism in the title. A historian friend of mine, I used to do many conferences for Cato and the Institute for Humane Studies, and a good friend of mine once asked us, George, when are you going to write a book without the word atheism in the title? I said, well, you know, I can publish, as long as the word's atheism in the title, you know, I can get it published. So if I write a book, I don't know, on carpentry, I'd probably call it Atheism in Carpentry, because somebody would publish it, you know. But let me put it this way, the book, I started writing the book when I was 22, I finished it when I was 23. It took a lot longer than I thought, and I went through that usual starving artist routine because I didn't have any money, and borrowing money from friends, which fortunately I was able to pay that. But I never expected the book, I thought it was a good book, but you know, in my early 20s, I was under a lot of pressure. I originally signed a contract for 4 months. The book took 1 year and 4 months, because Nash really just wanted sort of a short book. And at that stage, I didn't know how to deal with publishers, so I just sort of shook my head and agreed to anything he said, and I figured I'd worry about it later. Well, that worrying about it later, it consisted of 1 year with no money, holed up in an efficiency apartment on Selma Avenue in Hollywood, jumping every time the phone rang, fearing it was a bill collector or my publisher. Eventually letting the phone get cut off because I didn't want to have to deal with that anymore. And so those are my early sort of bohemian days, you might say.
Now, it's been 40 years since you wrote
40?
Atheism, the
Yeah.
Case Against God.
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
It's amazing. And you've never gone back on your decision?
No, that time even occurred to me seriously.
No.
It just seems to me, you know, it's funny to say this, but in one way, religion doesn't interest me personally. It's just something I'm fine without it. I don't feel like there's this void in my life or that I need God. I mean, we all go through personal problems, and it's nice, I suppose, to have a friend around. But I couldn't convince, I mean, how do you convince yourself to believe something you don't really believe? By the way, this is an old question that goes back centuries in the history of theology. If a person cannot see the evidence for believing, say, in a God or the God of Christianity, is that person somehow morally responsible? Because during the heyday of persecution, if you were a heretic, especially heretics, infidels were not considered punishable per se. If you were a Muslim or a Jew, it was different than if you were a heretic. A heretic is a person who's inside a belief system, who accepts it supposedly, and then dissents from parts of it. And the standard wisdom you find in Thomas Aquinas and others was that heretics are punishable by death after the second relapse into heresy. But infidels theoretically are not punishable. And you might ask the reason why. Well, they viewed heresy sort of like we do treason today. In other words, if you're inside a belief system and you betray it by denying some of its tenets, then you're thought to have known better. You should have known better because you understand the system, whereas a Jew or a Muslim may not understand Christianity. You're inside it and you're corrupting it from within. And that leads, and by the way, you find this in secular movements. I mean, I've been in the libertarian movement for many, many years, and this is true of other movements. Marxists, I've known many Marxists over the years. There are more internal debates, and people end up hating. It's like that Monty Python Life of Brian thing, with the Judean People's Front versus the People's Front of Judea. You know, they just hate each other, and they end up hating each other more than they hate the Romans. And that was a very insightful scene, because that's sort of the way it works. But anyway, personally, religion holds no appeal for me. Historically, I find it fascinating, which is why I've written some books about it. Because despite what many freethinkers might say, I don't consider the great theologians to be at all fools. Certainly they weren't. Many of them were geniuses of the highest caliber. And often what they put in theological terms can be translated, so to speak, into secular terms. Debates about original sin, for example, that's easy to see. Are people innately depraved? Are they innately good? There are many, and I just find it fascinating, the mindset. I mean, I'm probably one of the few atheists around who's actually read the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, which is a very, very large work, several times. And I just find it fascinating. He gets into angels, right? Well, what's the nature of angels? How do angels communicate? Well, apparently, according to Aquinas, they use some type of telepathy because they don't have vocal speech organs. I just find that fascinating. When somebody locks into a belief system, how do they deal with certain issues and what issues are important to them? I mentioned Augustine to you before. Maybe later we can go into some of his stuff, but his City of God, which is widely considered to be his masterpiece, is a fascinating, if today it seems utterly bizarre, but the fact that a top intellectual of his time would write something like this and it would be so influential, right away should command our attention. Well, what was it about this book? Well, the basic, and I know I'm digressing again, but the basic premise of this was it was written in the early 400s after the sack of Rome by the so-called barbarians. They were actually Christians, most of them, but they weren't the right type of Christians. And, you know, the eternal city had fallen. Now, so you have, you know, Christianity had been the official religion of the Roman Empire for around 100 years at that point, after Constantine. And so how come, for the first time in its history, Rome fell? Now, the old pagans, the guys who never liked Christianity, the old hardliners, started coming out and say, Christians, and I love this because it's like Christians say today about secularists, Roman culture degenerated because of Christianity. They ruined our traditional values. The traditional Roman values were sort of this militaristic, civic virtue, spirit, guys who would go out and fight for Rome, and now these pacifist, wussy Christians come along and teach love and all this crap, and we became sort of effeminate, it was a term that sometimes used, and we were overrun by barbarians. And it's all Christianity's fault. And it's a perfect counterpart to the decadence of Rome was caused by Christianity. Actually, Edward Gibbon later kind of picked up on that argument, gave a more sophisticated version, the decline of all the Roman Empire. But the Christians had to have a response for this, because Rome falling, although it wasn't really the political sin any longer of the Roman Empire that moved to the east, it was still considered the symbol of Rome, of Rome's power. But Augustine in the City of God set out to show that Rome's decadence the seeds had been planted long before Christianity came along. And the whole point of the City of God was to show that Christianity had nothing to do with the fall of Rome, or the sack, that the seeds of decadence were planted in the very early origin of Rome. And what it is sort of a mixture of theology and history trying to vindicate Christianity. Now, to me, that's worth reading in its own right, because it was such an influential book.